Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Able Voices podcast. I'm Dr. Rhoda Bernard, founding managing director of the Berklee Institute for Accessible Arts Education and the assistant chair of the Music Education Department at Berklee College of Music. And I'm proud to present this podcast featuring disabled artists and arts educators. We are inviting artists with disabilities to be guest hosts for the Able Voices podcast. Today's guest host is Ben Lunn. Ben Lunn is a music composer, conductor, musicologist, teacher, and associate artist for Drake Music and Drake Music Scotland. As a composer, Lunn's music reflects the material world around him, connecting his Northeastern heritage or how disability impacts the world around him or his working class upbringing. Alongside this, he has become renowned for his championship of others, which have seen him creating unique collaborations with musicians from across the globe and developing unique concert experiences and opportunities for others. He has won accolades from the Scottish Music Awards in both 2023 and 2020 for his work with Hebrides Ensemble and Drake Music Scotland. In 2022, Ben became the first Northeast composer to be selected for the Royal Philharmonic Society's Composer Scheme, which sees him paired with Music in the Round. As a musicologist, Lunn specializes in Baltic music, Horatiu, Radulescu, political ideology and composition, and composing and disability. He has had the honor of lecturing at some of the world's leading academic institutions, and his articles have been published across Germany, UK, US, Russia, Lithuania, and collected by the Arvo Hat Centre. In 2021, Ben also helped found the Disabled Artists Network, an organization which is bridging the gap between the professional world and disabled artists.
Welcome, everyone. I am Ben Lunn, a composer and conductor, and I am a special guest host for the Able Voices podcast. And it is my absolute pleasure to welcome my dear friend and colleague, Clare Johnston. Before I start asking Clare questions, we will hear a short excerpt of a piece by hers, and then we'll get into chatting. So I hope you enjoy this lovely excerpt of a piece by Clare Johnston. So what we just heard there was a short excerpt of her award-winning piece, Call of the Mountains. Clare, could you give us a bit of background into what that piece was, how it came to being, and the ideas behind it?
Yeah, so Call of the Mountains was sort of the end point of a collaboration that we did initially starting online between myself and the Igorou ensemble in Kazakhstan. And so their setup is that they have a contemporary music ensemble that also includes traditional Kazakh folk instruments. And it was an interesting experiment to add another layer onto that, to have the very ancient instruments, the very mainstream instruments, and then to add in the modern digital accessible instruments into that mix.
Wonderful. And what was that process like of sort of writing a piece for all of those combined and sort of quite curious forces?
It was interesting. It was very interesting. It's very much the sort of thing that I do, trying to look at not just how to make music accessible for people who are using somewhat different instruments, but also to try to have each set of the musicians enter each other's worlds. So there are parts of the piece which are tremendously difficult to play on a traditional instrument. There are parts of the piece which are tremendously difficult to play on the digital instruments, and we're using the strengths and characteristics of each instrument to sort of run back and forth between the different worlds of the digital instrument, where the MIDI creation is very free and very easy to do, but it's much more difficult to hit a specific given note, and then flipping that back the other way and getting the other instrumentalists to play something that is completely fine for it.
Wonderful. And it's a really just fascinating sort of ability to sort of bring all of them together. And it's the piece I've known as well for quite a long period of time. And what I've admired is the way that not only have you approached all the instruments as equals, but you've been able to sort of really highlight the specific voices and natures of the different instruments as well within the piece. So it doesn't feel like you say awkwardly trying to force every instrument to sound slightly Kazakh or sound Western or anything. It's actually really leaning into these qualities, which sort of adds to the overall sort of fascinating quality of the piece. And it's always lovely coming back and listening to it. So it's a pleasure to be able to share it to everyone here today. And so one question, I think, to sort of give a bit more background to yourself as an artist and as a musician and so on, is could you sort of talk about your journey into music and into the sort of the stuff that you do, because there are many facets to what you do, and I'm sure everyone will be very eager to hear all the things that you do as an artist.
Yeah, so I don't know if I've had one journey or several, or certainly my journey, I think, is a little bit like one of those mazes where you go down a few blind alleys and you do a couple of U-turns and say, okay, right, not that. So initially I probably followed the very normal mainstream course of things, did all the youth orchestras, auditioned for the music college on the viola, and then I started to really get an acceleration in my medical condition, and I just wasn't able to keep up with the hours that would be expected of a course like that. So although I could still play, I couldn't play for a performance degree anymore. So I took a bit of a sidestep with that, and I tried going to university for more of a sort of general music degree, but not as a performance student, and that didn't work for me. And so I went back to another university years later after a stint of not doing music at all. And that was in primary education. So that included music as part of that, but not as a sort of core part of the degree. And that didn't work out for me either. So I went to Napier University, and I brought all of my little bits of degrees from all kinds of different places, including the Open University, and sort of dumped them at their door and said, what can you give me? And they said, yeah, you can finish your music degree with us. So I did my final 2 years of my music performance degree, I think something like 23 years after I started it. So possibly the world's longest degree. And then I was introduced to Drake Music Scotland, who have a fine tradition of digital musical instruments, and specifically accessible musical instruments, building things that work for individual performers. And I had a good fidget with all of the stuff that they had available to see what instrument would speak to me. And the one that really did it for me was the iPad instrument thumb drum. So since sort of 2009, that's been my instrument, and that's been what I've been. And I never was a composer, never, until I met this instrument that has a lot to say.
So it's, yeah, as you say, it's I love the metaphor of the sort of going down an alley, turning back, trying to find another way out of this maze and so on. I think for many people like ourselves, that is part of the journey and part of the way we sort of accommodate sort of disability, either as it changes or just because we sort of find out where the various different limits or just actual just sort of reasonableness of certain things. Because obviously, in theory, there are some things we could potentially do, but is it reasonable for us to go through those things and try and forcibly make it happen? Whereas you've managed to find this really lovely, one just very unique sort of approach to it, but also just something that is just perfect for you. And also, I love how you as composer came out because of the iPad, and I think that's just really quite nice because many people sort of talk about a composer and their instrument and using their instruments and how that sort of is reflected in the various things they do. But when you sort of a new instrument has then opened you up to new possibilities, it's just a really magical little thing. And so I think before sort of we go on to other sort of nooks and crannies with all of this, is could you tell us a little bit about what it's like being a performer with the iPad as your main instrument?
Well, the first one is all of those conversations that you have with people, which is the same conversation every time. What do you do? I'm a musician. Oh, really? What do you play? Oh, no. Now I have to explain this again. So being able to get people to take a digital instrument seriously at all is probably the first battle. And getting people to understand what it is that you're doing because they're unfamiliar with it. So when they come to a concert and they see you perform, they don't really understand what it is that you're doing in the way that they've understood a violin since they were really tiny. They know what they're looking at. So that's probably sort of one of those hurdles. And the other side of it is the thing that is rather different about performing on an iPad in particular is that the notes can be moved anywhere you want them, which is fantastic for accessibility, but then it's also an extra challenge for being able to do something repeatable, because every time you sit down to the iPad, if you programmed it in a different way specific to a piece of music, then middle C might be in the middle, but it might be at the left-hand side, it might be at the right-hand side, it might not be there at all. And so your reference points are changing all the time.
Yeah, and it has to give sort of examples to a more traditional instrument. Is it's very similar to an organ in the sense of if the stops are set at say like 4 feet, it means that middle C is an octave lower than you'd expect it to be. Whereas obviously if the stops are at 16 foot, the middle C is then an octave higher than you would expect it to be. And it's that wonderful malleability, which I imagine for yourself as a creative person is fantastic, but it does mean standardizing it gets really frustrating because there isn't a standard approach to it.
And sometimes it's a middle G sharp.
Exactly. I think this sort of leads really nicely into the just another question that sort of everyone will be very interested to hear about is how has your experiences as a disabled artist and your art interacted? How have you sort of found navigating it either through say education, through being an artist and just in musical settings?
Yeah, there's still a lot of barriers. It's getting better, or perhaps I'm getting better at navigating it and staying away from the ones where there's problems. But yeah, because the first time that I found that I couldn't conform to the boxes that people like to put musicians into, I think I was about 12, and somebody said, well, you can't be in our orchestra if you can't hear. That's a basic thing about being a musician. And you think, actually, I seem to be doing all right, but thanks. So that was the first one. And then constantly going through all of those rejections of the idea of you as potentially being a professional musician, that you can't put in the number of practice hours per day that somebody somewhere has decided that this makes a professional musician and this doesn't. And or that this is, but for years, even though I was making my living from music, I felt like I could not refer to myself as a professional musician. And I went through years of saying music professional, uh, just because I had this idea in my head of what a professional musician looked like, and I wasn't that. So I couldn't be in the gang.
Yeah, and it's interesting to see how things have changed because it does feel like the past sort of 5 years there seems to be a point of we're maybe accepting that the traditional model isn't the only model, partly because of the way the pandemic forced a lot of learning to change. So it then meant that this ability of being a bit more adaptable became much more important, and also because on other fronts as well, so making sure that say more women are actually visible within the arts, not just in the few pretty places and all this other kind of stuff. So we are getting there, but we're still miles off in many different ways. Um, so yeah, so it's always an interesting sort of dynamic, and I'm curious sort of how you've sort of seen things sort of develop and improving because obviously different disabilities have sort of seen different advances at different ways. So in comparison to when you were younger, how do you sort of feel that sort of relationship is between sort of your disability and music?
I do think it's improving. I think there is still a distance to go in terms, because there had been this very, disabled people are there to be inspiring and not necessarily to be good. And we're definitely seeing that people are coming to concerts expecting music rather than lovely, shiny disabled people, which is fantastic. We're seeing improvements in accessibility in venues, and or more so the ability of venues to engage with us about accessibility. I think there's still a lot of very inaccessible venues, but they're getting better at wanting to do better and being able to get up onto stages, or venues where they are eliminating stages because they realise that that's such a huge accessibility barrier, and just having a flat area at the front and setting up the audience seating appropriately. All of that kind of thing is really developing. I think there's still a a gap between people's ability to adapt for something that they can see and for something that they can't see, and particularly for something that they think they might have some idea about. So being able to get wheelchair access is much easier than being able to explain to somebody, I can only work for a couple of hours a day and then I'm done. And then I need to go away and have a really good quality rest somewhere, and we'll start again tomorrow. And people sort of thinking, well, we all get tired. Can you just push through this one time? That angle of things is not improving at the same gradient as physical access, I don't.
Yeah, that puts it really well because that's the other thing I've sort of noticed as well, just speaking personally, because in the time that you've known me, my sort of circumstances have changed. So when I first came to Scotland, I was sort of bounding around with just my two legs, but now as I have a stick, it's been very interesting to sort of see the way people approach me as a disabled person because they can see I am much more obviously disabled, so I'm actually much more trusted in that instance, which is always just a very curious little thing. Even though I've sort of known I'm autistic since the age of 4, it's only been in the sort of the past 5 years that people have actually believed me to a certain degree on that instance, which is just a very strange situation to be in. So one thing I sort of want to sort of draw out, one, because you do such a wonderful job at it, is as you do a lot of teaching and mentoring, I'm sort of very curious to see sort of how you sort of navigate one, giving music to sort of wonderful young musicians across the place. So for those who don't know, me and Claire have worked together on a really lovely project with Digital Youth Orchestra in Edinburgh, with a local school to where Drake Music Scotland are based, and they were just great to work with. And this is led by Claire and other musicians, which Claire will tell me because I've completely forgotten their names. But yes, but could you sort of talk about one, your sort of approaches to sort of education, but also how you sort of see maybe the differences between, say, like the education that we got when we were younger and what you're able to give students now?
So that project was with Katie Davis and with the support of Alice, whose surname may come back to me, may not. So I think one of the biggest ways that these things have to differ is you can have a structure in mind when you go in, but everything has to come much more so from the student and than it does with, I suppose, mainstream music education. And part of that is having the freedom to do that in terms of being able to have a certain kind of funding of project. You're not constrained by the pass exams model of music teaching that unfortunately the schools generally tend to have to operate in. And but also you are unlikely to enjoy success if you come in with an idea of how you think that somebody's going to be able to operate, and then that's just not how they want to receive an education from it. And we have been able to work in some qualifications as part of what we've been doing, but it's been led by what are we trying to achieve, what are the students interested in, and can those things support a qualification, rather than these are the requirements of the qualification, let's just do those things and hope it brings out something interesting. Everything I tend to find is a strange sort of back to front with working in music with disability, rather than I'm going somewhere weird. Ignore that.
I mean, very happy to go somewhere weird because it's always just very interesting. So, partly as well is just because one thing I find really interesting now is we're in a really lucky position where there are a lot more disabled people who are able to teach as well. Because, like, when I grew up, I was autistic before people like Temple Grandin were known about. So the idea of, say, like, even being an adult was quite a crazy sort of thing to propose. So being able to sort of see people like myself and be able to learn off them was never really something that was considered. Whereas now we're in a really lovely position where people like me and you are able to sort of give back in a certain way. So it is just, I find it just a really positive and promising thing that we're able to help out as much as we can. And I'm sort of curious as well, sort of beyond sort of the lovely digital orchestra youth, are there other sort of other areas of education you do? Because I know there's like not necessarily education, but sort of music leadership is probably a better word for iPad Lab. I think that's probably a nice thing to sort of talk a little bit more about, is that how you sort of work together with the other lovely musicians in that, as you are sort of the matriarch is probably the nicest way to describe it.
Yeah, the iPad Lab is it's very experimental as a little group. We do usually end up at the end of a period of time with something that is a performance, but the performance pieces are really born out of a lot of time spent experimenting with something tremendously niche. And I don't want to give too much away for the future, but at the moment we have been working on the experiences of music as a sound for individual people, and what that is like and how that differs for people with different relationships with sound, whether they have particular sounds that they can't bear, or particular sounds that are unusually attractive to them. So myself, I have quite strange hearing, even among people that wear hearing aids. Mine's one of the niche varieties, and we are looking into this aspect of what I need from sound that's different from what somebody else needs from sound, and what does, going beyond this, that I think has been well trodden now, of music for deaf people being vibrations, that it needs to be more than that. It needs to be a variety of good vibrations, but also supported with visuals perhaps, or if somebody does have residual hearing, how can we tap into that residual hearing? And how can we also make something that works for everybody else who's in the room all at the same time? So that's easy.
A nice light task, certainly. But what I find interesting as well is that, as you sort of say, a lot of the previous approaches to deafness has just been nice, positive vibrations, and not assuming that we may like an interesting journey. So, like this idea of, say, going through a dark patch to eventually get to somewhere brighter again, so we feel even better because we got there. Because it's a bit like when was initially sort of doing some of the concerts, like we did with Drake Music Scotland and Hebrides. I had to sort of remind people that yes, autistic people will have very sensitive hearing, but that doesn't mean they don't enjoy loud. It's just a very particular kind of loud, and it's how you sort of navigate that is always the tricky one. And it's always just quite nice to sort of show that we're not just the stereotypes as well, which I think is one less nice that things are improving across the board generally, but it is always interesting that through music we're able to challenge this really quite actively in a way that surprises lots of other people. And sort of thinking with that in mind, with some of the creations you've done in the past, particularly with, say, iPad Lab, are there any ones that that you think have surprised the listeners more than anything else, or just the audience members more than you sort of expected they would be surprised?
I think there was a piece, Confused, that I did a number of years ago, and it was a metaphor for my own journey through music. That it started with a very typical ancient musical form of the fugue, and very traditional instrument set, and just gradually morphed its way over into a much more electronic iPad performance space. But it was so gradual through the piece of music that I think the listener's sort of sitting there thinking, something's changed, but I don't quite know what it is yet. And to be able to get from A to B, but not really be able to articulate where that transition took place, is a fabulous metaphor for that trip that I'd been on through my musical journey of playing Baroque viola to playing electronic iPad music. It didn't just have a moment overnight where everything that I knew went away and something else came in. Everything that I've learned and know and appreciate is part of the bundle of what I do now.
But I think to maybe come back a little bit more to run back to what we did at the very, very beginning with our talk about Call of the Mountains, because we'd mentioned very briefly that it came about through sort of working online as well as then the eventual concert and so on. So I think everyone would sort of love to hear a bit more about the nitty gritty of what was involved in that, because what had happened is, working together, myself and Claire, we'd managed to get funding from the British Council for a digital partnership. And so Claire was able to sort of mentor eGuru in a certain way, and then they were able to sort of help Claire. And then from there was lots of other bits going on. So do you want to sort of fill in the gaps a bit more and give a bit more information about not only sort of how you found the journey from that initial introductory cross-mentoring bit, but also just exploring music, say, from Kazakhstan, and then eventually composing Call of the Mountains as well?
Yeah, I certainly had a lot to learn about traditional Kazakh folk instruments, because it's certainly it's not the country that gets enough exposure, the international stage, and I had absolutely no knowledge whatsoever, I'm ashamed to say, of what Kazakh traditional music might even be. So I was led fantastically by Igorou into listening journey. And also I get a lot of inspiration from places and landscapes and all of this kind of thing. So unfortunately, plans to actually go to Kazakhstan fell through with all the things that've been happening in the world, but I managed to get a good look at a load of very exciting photographs that were sent over and all of this sort of thing, and try to understand the relationships of the landscape and how the traditional instruments and their use fitted into that landscape, and started getting together an inspiration for how I might fit our Scottish traditions and our Scottish musicians, and also the relatively new history, as it were, of our electronic instruments, and drop those into this physical and musical landscape as well.
Wonderful. And what I think was also just really lovely with this project, as well as just as an outsider who sort of helps facilitate it, is one, seeing the ensemble fall in love with Clare and her approach to things, but I imagine sort of you falling in love with all the wonderful members of Igoroo and their music. And we were just surprised is probably a very modest way of describing how it felt when we suddenly got told that they're coming to Scotland. They managed to just sort of magic money out of nowhere. And when we did call it the whole concert, we named after Clare's wonderful piece. And what was really wonderful in that concert as well is not only did it become a wonderful opportunity to showcase the wonderful instruments like the iPad and other accessible musical instruments, we were able to showcase works by composers from Kazakhstan and other Central Asian nations, which I'm almost certain that all of them were sort of UK premieres, because it is just an area, like Claire says, just isn't shared in Britain and or in Western Europe or the Western world. And so lots of magical things happened, and it's all thanks to a Zoom meeting in many ways, which is just always a lovely surprise to see what comes out of these various different kinds of things. And so, yeah, so I think sort of as a sort of a good, it's quite a big open sort of question, is what sort of advice would you give to young artists who are disabled, sort of either trying to work their way through it or wanting to sort of just get into it in the first place? How would you sort of encourage them to sort of explore music, either as artists or in the various different ways of working that you do?
I think you have a fantastic opportunity to be unique in this space. And of course, if what you want to do is to be very like somebody who inspires you and to be very much part of the mainstream, then absolutely pursue that. But you've also got the opportunity to carve something out that not only, and I'll come back around to that, not only support you with your access needs, but has something of value to communicate to the world. And in the process of having a story to tell, I think it makes it much easier to find inspiration. That I don't know that I could write something for a piano, because people have been doing that for a very long time and they've written everything. In my mind, as a non-pianist, I feel like it's been well spoken for over the years, whereas the iPad has a very small repertoire and plenty still to be made for it. But yeah, I think it's a common mistake for people to start from the access need and concentrate on a thing that's going to be perfect for this person because of their access need, and not remember to think about how important it is that it's an inspiring journey for that person. So I so often say to people, does anybody remember being started out on the wrong instrument and just not being able to progress with it, not being able to gel with it because you always wanted to play the flute, and someone said, well, I haven't got a flute, but you can have a violin, and you're just stuck in this soundscape and type of music that you don't want to make. So if people, it's even worse in the disability and accessible music area, that people will start from the person's physical access needs and go, this instrument will meet your access needs. If you don't enjoy playing it, it's not going to work.
Exactly. And it gives me two very contrasting, but one's very funny, the other one's just a bit more serious. But whenever I've sort of done sort of awareness training for people, I've always reiterated that access isn't about changing a thing so much that it's no longer the core of what that thing is. And so, like, if, say, a disabled person wants to play a tuba because it makes loud noises and looks silly, if you then destroyed that character to make it accessible, you've no longer done it accessibly. You have to there is something that attracted that person to that instrument or to that thing. The question is, how on earth do we get that to fit them, is always the challenge. But the other one that always comes to my mind when I'm talking about, say, like, expectations of what instruments people want to play as disabled people. The French horn player Felix Kleiser is a French horn player who was born without arms, and he plays the French horn. And there's just a wonderful interview where he was asked by a German interviewer, just going, "Oh, playing the French horn must be very difficult to play with your feet." To which he replied, "Well, it's easier than with my hands." And it's a wonderful encapsulation of what it's like, because at the end of the day, he wanted to play that instrument because he loves it, and he found a way. And it's a really wonderful sort of flipping around of sort of the expectations of it, and it always makes me smile, just because and it's also just delivered in such a German manner, which makes it all the funnier when you hear it. So it's just to join. I think you captured it really beautifully, and it's that passion is the thing that should be leading, and then try and get everything in behind it.
Definitely, and it's one of those things that can take a lot of extra time in an educational project, that you do have to find the instrument that somebody wants to play and the sound that they want that instrument to make, which in digital instruments is, of course, a larger capability. When you first play a flute, it's going to make flute sounds. So, but we have to make the decision of, okay, we've got the outline of the instrument that is going to be playable and excite our musician. What do they want it to play? Do they want it to play one sound predominantly? Do they want it to be able to play that wide variety of sounds, or to be able to play a set of split sounds so that they can make harmonies within their own instrument and all of this kind of thing? And until you get that right, there's not a great deal of point in pushing on with the project. You've got to wait until the person's eyes light up and go, yeah, that's the sound I've been wanting to make all this time.
Couldn't have put it better myself. It's a really wonderful way of doing it. Just wait till the eyes light up and then you found the thing. So I think we're sort of coming towards the end of our time. So I just wanted to sort of give you a very open-ended question are there any other sort of thoughts or just things you'd like to share about sort of your entry into the world of music or the part you play within it, or just anything that you thought would be of interest to any of the listeners?
Think of anything.
Well, it's just a real sign of just how modest you are, because there was a very wonderful qualification you've gotten very recently, which I admit isn't music related, but I just think it's very much part of your journey. Do you want to talk about gliders, just very quickly, about the wonderful sort of qualification you now have?
But there's absolutely another area of the world in which I'm surprising people of the kinds of things that disabled people can do. But I've recently become a qualified glider pilot. I've been flying upside down a lot recently. Started to learn how to do aerobatics, and it's a moment of processing in people's heads when you come into a room and you say, okay, this is me. I'm a musician. This is what I do, and let's go around the room and everybody say who they are, and then give us a conversation starter of something that you hope people will come and talk to you about in the break. mine is that I'm a glider pilot, and the processing in people's heads. What? But you disabled? Have you noticed?
But what I particularly love about it, with you being a glider pilot, is we now have a 21st century equivalent to Karl-Heinz Stockhausen's helicopters. So we had one composer who was obsessed with helicopters and had the lovely helicopter quartet. We now have yourself with a glider, so we now just need to work out how we can tie that into a piece of music. But it's a tradition that's well worth keeping alive.
I would imagine the air brakes give different frequencies. No, I get it.
See, we've got an idea brewing already, so we'll talk to Creative Scotland to see if we can raise some funds. Wonderful. It's been, as always, it's very, very good just to chat to you at the best of times, but it's also been very nice and been a wonderful pleasure to be able to chat to you as part of the Able Voices podcast. I hope everyone who has been listening has enjoyed the tidbits, and hopefully their sort of expectations of what sort of disabled people could do, either say in regards to sort of flying in the air, music making, or sort of leading music education, as well as also just sort of the international relations that we can get up to as well. There's some really fascinating things, and I think Claire's just a wonderful example of just, if you just gan for it, who knows what on earth you can do. And so on behalf of myself and Claire, thank you very much for listening, and look forward to hearing you next time. Thank you.
Able Voices is a production of the Berklee Institute for Accessible Arts Education, led by me, Dr. Rhoda Bernard, the founding managing director. It is produced by Daniel Martinez del Campo. The intro music is by Kai Levin, and our closing song is by Sebastian Batista. Kai and Sebastian are students in the arts education programs at the Berklee Institute for Accessible Arts Education. If you would like to learn more about our work, find us online at berkeley.edu/BIAAE or email us at BIAAE@berkeley, that's LEE.edu.